I'm going to be taking a look at the 8BitDo Lite SE, which 8BitDo describe as being a controller that is compact, mobile and designed for the needs of gamers with limited mobility. But do some of the qualities that make it good for its intended audience also translate into something that also works great for the more able-bodied gamer? And are we missing out on a great controller by dismissing it too easily? Let's find out. Taking a quick look around the controller, one of the first things that hits you is that there are a lot more buttons on the face of the controller than you would normally expect to see there. The other thing that hit me pretty much straight away when I picked it up is the thick rubber pad on the back of the controller and how awkward and slightly unpleasant it felt when holding the controller. The thing is, the controller has been designed to be played not by holding it, but by placing it flat on a table. And the idea of the rubber pad on the back is to prevent it slipping and sliding around the table during gameplay. Of course, you can use it by holding it in your hand, but I really didn't like the feel of that rubber pad, and I had a constant feeling that my fingers were catching against the edge of it, along with a worry that I was going to start inadvertently peeling it off. It all just felt a bit off-putting while trying to play. Those buttons that are all over the face of the gamepad, the reason that there are so many is because 8BitDo have taken the shoulder buttons and triggers and moved them from their normal positions and placed them on the face of the controller to put them within easy reach of the other buttons. And that includes L3 and R3, which have their own buttons towards the center of the gamepad and above the thumbsticks. And in case you are wondering, yes, pressing down on the sticks also gives you L3 and R3. Something I've tested using Gamepad Tester. As you would expect from 8BitDo, the build quality is top-notch and it feels solid and robust in the hand. I would have preferred to see a proper D-pad on this, but given that it has been designed for people with limited mobility, I guess I can't be too critical of the decision not to include one. And even though I normally hate the use of directional buttons instead of a D-pad, I've got to say that this really didn't bother me at all on this controller. I suspect a large part of that might be down to just how ridiculously sensitive all of the buttons actually are. Comparing it with the original 8BitDo Lite, you could easily rest your fingers on the buttons of the original Lite and press them when you needed to. With the Lite SE, that just isn't possible. The buttons are so sensitive that just touching them with even the lightest bit of pressure causes them to be pressed. There is no way you could rest the finger on any of these buttons without pressing them in. Depending on your style of play, this could either be seen as a good or a bad thing. For me, I adjusted to these super sensitive buttons very quickly, and for most types of games I was perfectly happy with the buttons and the controller. For the most part. I say for the most part because at times my fingers would sometimes drift slightly and occasionally I ended up pressing the R1 and R2 buttons by mistake. I put this down to a couple of things. The first being that I hadn't played the controller regularly enough to be familiar enough with it, so that the position of the buttons became second nature to me. The second reason I put down to the fact that where I might normally ever so lightly rest my fingers or thumb over the top of the A, B, X, Y buttons, just ever so slightly touching them, I couldn't do that with this controller because of the sensitivity of the buttons. I found myself hovering my thumb just above the buttons, and at times I think I was losing track as to which button I was hovering over. The end result was that I ended up hitting the wrong button a few times. But apart from my occasional cack-handedness, the one area where I noticed a huge improvement was when playing fighting games. I'm not the best when it comes to fighting games, but when using this controller, I was performing far better than I normally would with a normal controller. That super sensitivity that this controller has really paid off in lightning fast reactions, although there were more than a few times I wished they had included a D-pad instead of the directional buttons. If it had that, then I think this would have been absolutely fantastic, but as it stands, I still found it to be excellent. This controller is not going to be right for every type of game, obviously, and fans of first-person shooters and driving games in particular are probably going to hate it. But it's far from being useless when it comes to that sort of game. It's just that the button layout is unfamiliar and not exactly optimal for them. And of course there is no analog triggers here. but that's something that's common to a lot of other controllers. So what about the sticks? Well, running it through Gamepad Tester, you can see that they're pretty decent with no sign of dead zones, and as I mentioned earlier, they also allow for the L3, R3 presses if you don't want to use the dedicated buttons on the face of the controller. The controller's not perfect, and for me, it's mainly that rubber pad underneath that bothers me when I'm holding the controller in my hand. But minor niggles aside, I think this is a really good controller, which at the current price of $35 is pretty reasonable for what you're getting. I've certainly paid a lot more and got a lot worse than this in the past. But before you make a decision on this, I'd urge you to check out my review of the 8BitDo Lite 2, which came out at the same time as this. It's very similar. It doesn't have the features for gamers with mobility issues, and instead comes with a more traditional button layout. It's on the screen at the moment, and it's one I'm sure you'll be interested in.